So, given that lying is such a special category of deception, I figured it made a lot of sense to think about how it applied to international politics. Now, what I discovered is that there are five kinds of international lies. And let me tell you what the five kinds of lies are. The first kinds of lies are interstate lies. Interstate lies are where the leader of one country lies either to the leader of another country or to a foreign audience. And let me give you a good example of that. During the Cold War, the United States was very interested in convincing the Soviet Union that we would use nuclear weapons to defend Europe were the Soviets to attack into Western Europe. And this is in large part because the threat of nuclear use by the United States was a wonderful way of deterring the Soviets from attacking in the first place. If the Soviets thought that we were going to use nuclear weapons and a conventional war in Europe would therefore likely escalate to the nuclear level, they would never start such a war. So we had a vested interest in convincing the Soviets that we would use those nuclear weapons. Of course, it was not clear that we would use nuclear weapons to defend Europe. Because if the Soviets were overrunning Western Europe, as bad as that would be, it's nowhere near as bad as a general thermonuclear war that ends up in the United States getting incinerated. So there were all sorts of reasons to think we wouldn't use the nuclear weapons, which of course is why our leaders went to great lengths to say we would use nuclear weapons. Henry Kissinger and Robert McNamara both said when they were in positions of power that they would use nuclear weapons to defend Europe. Both of them later said that they would have never used nuclear weapons to defend Europe. And when they made those statements, they were bluffing. Bluffing, by the way, is a euphemism for lying. They were bluffing. I think it made eminently good sense for them to bluff because it helped make deterrence work in Europe during the Cold War. But the key point is they are admitting that they were lying. So interstate lying is the first kind of lying. The second kind of lying is fear-mongering. A euphemism for fear-mongering might be threat inflation. Fear-mongering is where a leader lies to his or her own public. It's very different than lying to another country. What the Bush administration did in the run-up to the Iraq War is an example of fear-mongering. The Bush administration understood full well that the American public was not enthusiastic about fighting a war against Iraq. So they felt that what they had to do was make it clearer than the truth, to borrow Dean Acheson's words, that Saddam Hussein was so dangerous that he had to be removed from power. And in the process, they told 4 separate lies. And more generally, they waged a deception campaign. And I, of course, have pointed out a number of those lies already. That's fear-mongering. And there are other examples as well. Lyndon Johnson, some of us in the audience are old enough to remember the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, where Johnson lied about what the North Vietnamese were doing in the Gulf of Tonkin early in August 1964, because he wanted to get a resolution through Congress that basically gave him carte blanche to wage the Vietnam War. That's fear-mongering. A third kind of lying is what I call strategic cover-ups. A good example of a strategic cover-up is President Kennedy lying about the deal that he cut with Nikita Khrushchev to end the Cuban Missile Crisis. What Kennedy was doing was employing a very controversial policy. He made a very important and controversial policy decision that he could not afford to tell the American people and the Europeans about. So he covered it up. He lied. That's what I call a strategic cover-up. It's the third kind of lying. Fourth kind of lying is nationalist myth-making. All states are infected with nationalism. And nationalism invariably involves telling lies about your past. What all countries do is engage in myth-making. They tell stories that portray themselves as the good guys and portray the other as the bad guys. We're all familiar with this process. The example I like to use, because it affected me at one point in time, has to do with the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. When I was young, I believed, and virtually everyone I knew believed, that the reason the Palestinians left what became Israel in 1948 was because the Arab leaders told them to leave, because they were then going to come in and murder all the Jews, and then the Palestinians could move back into their homes, and there would be no Jews left because the Arab armies would have finished all of them off. So in effect, it was the Palestinians' own fault for listening to the Arabs and leaving their homes and going outside of mandatory Palestine and creating the problem of all these refugees. We now know, mainly through the work of Israeli historians, that this is not what happened. In fact, there's not a shred of evidence that that's what happened. What happened is that the Israelis ethnically cleansed Palestine. They pushed about 700,000 Palestinians out, and then they would not allow them to return to their homes. This is a nationalist myth. And the United States and all sorts of other countries have similar myths. I'm not picking on Israel here. Israel is not an exception in this regard. But this is nationalist myth-making. Then the final kind of lying, international lying, is liberal lies. We have today, around the world, a well-established body of norms regarding how to think about war, how to think about when it's permissible to go to war, how to think about what is permissible in the conduct of war, and so forth and so on. And these norms are very closely aligned with basic just war theory. So when states go out and misbehave or act in ways that violate the laws of war, they invariably go to great lengths to try and cover up what they did and portray it in a very different manner. My favorite two liberal lies involve, first of all, the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front in World War II and British bombing policy in that same conflict. Just with regard to the Wehrmacht, when World War II ended, the United States found itself in a very interesting position. During the war, we were allied with the Soviet Union, fighting against Germany. During the Cold War, which followed World War II, we were aligned with Germany, fighting against the Soviet Union. We switched partners, and we switched adversaries. All of this is to say, we effectively jumped into bed with a lot of people who had been key players in what is probably the most murderous regime in modern history. And because the Germans were so important for creating military power in the center of Europe during the Cold War, we had to clean them up. So we, working in conjunction with the Germans, cooked up the myth that the Wehrmacht, the German military, in particular the German army, had virtually nothing to do with all the murder and mayhem on the Eastern Front in World War II. The Wehrmacht, we argued at the time, and I of course believed this, had clean hands. And it was only the Einsatz group and the special police forces and so forth and so on that were involved in the killing that took place on the Eastern Front. Indeed, that was not true at all. It was a lie. The Wehrmacht was inextricably bound up in the German killing machine on the Eastern Front, and the Wehrmacht did not have clean hands, it had filthy hands. But given that we needed the Wehrmacht, or the remnants of the Wehrmacht, to create the Bundeswehr, we had to tell ourselves and tell others a story that was comprised of lies. And then the other case involves Bomber Harris. In the spring of 1942, the British were desperate, and they thought the only card they had to play against Germany was to use their military, their Air Force, to bomb civilian areas in Germany and kill as many German civilians as possible. But of course, the British did not want to advertise to the world that they were purposely murdering civilians, which of course is what they were doing. They were murdering civilians. It's clearly against the laws of war and international norms to purposely kill civilians. But that's what the British were doing under Bomber Harris. So what did the British do? They lied. They said that they were bombing military targets and they were bombing economic targets. And they were not targeting civilians, when in fact they were targeting civilians. That's a liberal lie. So the 5 kinds of lies I see are interstate lies, where leaders lie to foreign audience, fear-mongering, where leaders lie to their own public to inflate a threat, strategic cover-ups, again, President Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, nationalist myth-making, this is countries inventing stories about their founding, for example, to make them look like the good guys and others look like the bad guys, and then liberal lies, which I just talked about. So those are the 5 kinds of lying.